December 17, 1944, 11:30 in the morning. The forest east of Krinkelt, Belgium, sits under 8 inches of fresh snow, with more falling in gray sheets that cut visibility to less than 300 yards. The temperature hovers at 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Private First Class Jose Mendoza Lopez, 34 years old, 5 feet 5 inches tall, 130 pounds, kneels behind a Browning M1919A4 machine gun in a shallow foxhole that offers no protection above his waist. He has been in this war since June 7, 1944, the day after D-Day, when a piece of shrapnel tore into him on the Normandy beachhead, and he refused the medics who wanted to send him home. He carries a machine gun that weighs 31 pounds on its own, mounted on a 14-pound tripod, with a 250-round belt of .30 caliber ammunition, adding another 17 pounds to what he has to move. Total load, moving alone through snow, better than 60 pounds of steel, wood, and brass on top of a wool overcoat, boots packed with frozen mud, and a rifle he no longer has time to carry. The weather has grounded every Allied aircraft for a week. No fighters overhead to spot German armor. No artillery observers in the sky to call in fire before the enemy is on top of the line. The forest itself, dense with fir trees bent under snow load, swallows sound until a diesel engine is close enough to feel through the ground. Lopez hears that engine before he sees anything. Tank treads, grinding ice and frozen earth, somewhere in the timber to his front. He is a member of Company K, 3rd Battalion, 23rd Infantry Regiment, 2nd Infantry Division, dug in along a ridge east of the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath. 18 hours earlier, at 5:30 on December 16, the German army had launched an offensive that would come to be called the Battle of the Bulge, throwing more than 250,000 men and hundreds of tanks against a thin American line stretched across the Ardennes forest. Company K's right flank looks solid on paper. It is not solid on the ground. And in the next 6 hours, Lopez will move his machine gun 3 separate times, alone under direct fire, to plug gaps that keep opening faster than his commanders can close them. If Lopez fails here, Company K does not conduct an orderly withdrawal. It gets swallowed. German infantry, backed by at least one Tiger tank rolling through the tree line, will fold around both flanks of the position and cut off the line of retreat to Krinkelt. Every wounded man Company K cannot evacuate becomes a prisoner or a casualty left in the snow. Every minute Lopez cannot buy is a minute the German 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend gains toward the Elsenborn Ridge, a strip of high ground that, if the Germans take it, opens the road toward Liege, and the fuel and supply dumps the entire offensive is racing to capture. A 24-year-old private first class with a machine gun standing between an army and one of the most important stretches of high ground in the entire campaign. That is where this story begins. 5 days before that morning, Company K had been pulled into a defensive position east of Krinkelt as part of the 2nd Infantry Division's push toward the Roer River dams, an operation command believed would be the division's main effort through Christmas. Nobody in the chain of command expected what came next. Intelligence reports in the days before December 16 had noted German rail movement and reserve buildup in the Ardennes, but staff officers at higher headquarters judged the German army incapable of mounting a major offensive that winter. The 2nd Infantry Division was thinly stretched, its regiment spread across a sector far wider than doctrine recommended for a static defense, because the division's attention and reserves were pointed toward the Roer dams, not toward defending against an attack nobody believed was coming. Lopez had reason to trust his own instincts about combat more than most men in his company. He was born on July 10, 1910, in the town of Santiago Ixhuatlan Plumas, in Oaxaca, Mexico, and lost his mother to tuberculosis when he was 8 years old. He crossed roughly 600 miles alone as a teenager to reach relatives in Brownsville, Texas, where he worked picking cotton and vegetables through the 1920s. As a young man, he boxed professionally under the name Kid Mendoza, compiling a record built on speed rather than size, before spending time in the Merchant Marine. He was drafted in 1942, the same year he married Emilia Herrera, and trained at Camp Roberts, California, before joining the heavy weapons platoon of Company M, 23rd Infantry Regiment, 2nd Infantry Division. He landed at Omaha Beach on June 7, 1944, the second day of the invasion, and was wounded almost immediately. He refused evacuation and stayed with his unit. Over the following 6 months, he fought through the hedgerow country around St. Lo, one of the most costly close-quarters campaigns of the entire European theater, and through the reduction of the fortified port city of Brest, where German garrison troops held out in concrete emplacements for weeks. By the time his division reached Belgium in December, Lopez had already earned a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, and the men around him had stopped questioning whether the short, quiet machine gunner from Texas could handle himself under fire. Nobody doubted him anymore. What nobody could have predicted was how far past ordinary courage this one morning would push him. The German force forming up against the 2nd Infantry Division's positions was not a scratch formation of old men and boys thrown together in the offensive's final planning weeks, as some sectors of the German line had become by late 1944. Opposite Krinkelt and Rocherath stood elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, a unit built around a corps of experienced officers and non-commissioned officers who had fought in Normandy, reinforced with younger conscripts and Hitler Youth volunteers. Supporting infantry divisions pressed the villages from multiple directions, with Tiger and Panther tanks moving through the forest tracks that American planners had assumed were impassable to armor in winter conditions. The German timetable called for a rapid breakthrough toward the Meuse River within the offensive's opening days. The twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath sat squarely on the route. The German 6th Panzer Army needed to reach the fuel depots and road networks that would let the offensive keep moving. By the morning of December 17, Company K had already absorbed casualties from the opening barrage and the 1st Infantry probes. Foxholes dug for a defensive line built around mutual support, were being abandoned one by one as neighboring positions fell silent. The company's own machine gun crews, spread thin to cover a frontage wider than any training manual recommended, could not mass fire fast enough to stop infiltration. Command believed the German main effort would strike Company K's right flank, based on terrain and the direction of the previous night's probing attacks, and Lopez had set up his Browning there accordingly, in a fortified position with what little cover the frozen ground allowed. The attack, when it came in full strength, came instead against the left. Everything Lopez and his commanders had planned for was about to be wrong, and there would be no time to plan again. The weapon Lopez carried that morning was the Browning M1919A4, a .30 caliber, air-cooled, belt-fed machine gun manufactured by several contractors during the war, including Buffalo Arms and Saginaw Steering Gear, a division of General Motors. The gun itself weighed 31 pounds. Its lightweight infantry tripod, developed specifically to make the weapon more mobile than its water-cooled predecessor, added another 14 pounds, for a combined firing weight of roughly 45 pounds before a single round of ammunition was attached. The M1919A4 fired at a cyclic rate of approximately 400 to 550 rounds per minute, with an effective range against area targets of 1,500 yards, and a maximum range considerably beyond that, though accuracy at extended distances against individual soldiers dropped off sharply past 800 yards. Standard doctrine called for a 5-man crew to operate the weapon in the field. A squad leader, a gunner who fired the weapon and carried the tripod and one ammunition box when advancing, an assistant gunner who fed the belt and carried a second ammunition box along with a spare parts kit, and 2 additional ammunition bearers who kept the gun supplied during sustained engagements. A single 250-round belt of standard ball ammunition weighed close to 17 pounds when packed in its steel can. In a defensive position with a full crew, the gun could sustain heavy fire for extended periods because ammunition resupply, barrel changes, and stoppage clearance were distributed across multiple men working in coordination. None of that applied to what Lopez was about to do. His crew was gone, killed or scattered or pinned down elsewhere along a collapsing line, and the tactical situation gave him no time to reorganize one. What the manual called a 5-man weapon system, Lopez was about to operate as a 1-man weapon system, carrying it, firing it, feeding it, and displacing it entirely on his own, 3 separate times, under direct enemy observation, through snow that slowed every step and exposed every movement against a white background. The M1919A4 had been designed as a lighter alternative to the older water-cooled M1917, specifically to improve battlefield mobility. But even its designers had not envisioned a single soldier hauling the complete system, tripod and ammunition included, across open ground under tank fire, setting it up, exhausting a belt, then doing it again. Standard infantry doctrine did not have a category for what Lopez was about to attempt, because no sane doctrine assumes one man replaces an entire crew and keeps functioning as a weapon of war. Lopez stood 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed roughly 130 pounds, a build shaped by years of boxing rather than by the imposing physical presence commanders sometimes look for when assigning heavy weapons roles. When he first joined the Army, some of the men around him assumed his size would be a liability in the infantry, let alone in a role that meant hauling a machine gun and its equipment across broken ground. His boxing record, fighting as a lightweight under the name Kid Mendoza, told a different story to anyone who bothered to look. Speed, balance, and an ability to absorb punishment without losing composure had defined him in the ring for years before the war, and those same qualities would define him again in the Ardennes. Doubt about Lopez did not survive his first combat exposure. The wound he took on D-Day +1, and his refusal to leave his unit for treatment, told the men around him everything they needed to know about his priorities. Through the hedgerows near Saint-Lô, where German defenders used the thick Norman terrain to ambush advancing Americans at close range again and again, and through the grinding reduction of the port fortress at Brest, Lopez built a reputation as a steady hand under fire, the kind of soldier other men wanted beside them when things went wrong. He had married Emilia Herrera in 1942, before shipping overseas, and by December 1944, he was fighting not for an abstract idea of glory, but to get home to a wife who was waiting for him in Texas. That motivation, ordinary and unglamorous, sat underneath everything he was about to do. He was not chasing a medal. He was trying to keep his company alive long enough to see her again, and the only way he knew to do that was to make sure the men beside him made it out first. If you want to see how Jose Lopez's decision to abandon a fortified position and carry his machine gun into open ground, alone, changed the outcome for an entire company of American soldiers, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss the next story we bring back from the archives. Now, back to Jose Lopez, in the snow east of Krinkelt, with a diesel engine growing louder in the trees ahead of him. 11:30 a.m. The attack that command expected on Company K's right flank never fully materializes there. Instead, the pressure builds fast and hard on the left, where German infantry supported by armor push forward through the tree line in numbers that overwhelm the thin American positions almost immediately. Word reaches Lopez in fragments, shouted between foxholes, that the left flank is collapsing and there is no gun covering it. He has a choice in front of him that takes less than a second to make. Stay in his prepared position on the right, where he has cover and a clear field of fire, or abandon it entirely and move, alone, carrying a 45-pound weapon system across open, snow-covered ground toward a fight that is already going badly. He chooses to move. The distance is short in absolute terms, a few hundred yards through broken forest, but every yard is exposed against fresh snow that makes a moving man impossible to miss. He breaks the gun down enough to carry it, slings the tripod, grabs what ammunition he can manage and starts running. Machine gun fire is already crossing the space he has to cover. If a round finds him before he reaches the left flank, Company K loses the only weapon capable of stopping the German push, and nobody else is close enough to take his place in time. He runs anyway. Just past 11:30, Lopez reaches the left flank and does not have time to dig. He throws himself into a shallow hole scraped out earlier by another soldier, a position that offers no protection above his waist. He sets the tripod, mounts the gun, feeds the belt, and opens fire on a cluster of German infantry advancing through the trees roughly 300 yards out. 10 Germans go down in the first burst. It is not a warning shot or a delaying action. It is a kill count that stops an advance in its tracks and buys the collapsing flank its first minutes of breathing room since the attack began. The Germans do not withdraw. A Tiger tank, moving through the forest track behind the infantry, spots Lopez's muzzle flash and turns its attention toward the shallow hole. Main gun rounds begin impacting near his position, throwing frozen dirt and snow into the air close enough that the concussion reaches him with every shot. He does not move, ignoring the tank, because there is nothing his machine gun can do against armor, and moving means losing the flank again. He keeps his fire trained on the infantry, and a second group, roughly 25 more German soldiers attempting to swing around and turn his position from the side, walks directly into his line of fire. He cuts them down as well. In the space of a few minutes from one position, with no crew and no relief, Lopez has broken 2 separate infantry pushes aimed at the same flank. The position becomes untenable almost as soon as it proves effective. The Tiger's crew, unable to hit him directly, begins walking rounds closer with each shot, and German infantry to his front, thinned but not eliminated, keep feeding fresh men into the assault. Glancing to his right, Lopez sees a new mass of infantry swarming in from a different angle entirely, moving to outflank the flank he just spent 10 minutes saving. Dazed from a shell that impacted only a few yards from his hole, ears ringing, vision swimming at the edges, he understands the math before he fully processes the pain. This position is finished. If he stays, he dies here and the gap reopens anyway. He has to move again, sometime after noon. Alone, still carrying the machine gun, Lopez pulls back to a new position to the right rear of the sector. A spot chosen not because it offers better cover, but because it puts him at an angle where he can still fire into the German advance while the rest of Company K executes what is becoming an organized withdrawal toward Krinkelt. Enemy tanks and infantry are pressing the retreat from multiple directions now, and the gap between an orderly withdrawal and a rout is measured in minutes, not hours. Lopez sets the gun again, feeds another belt, and resumes fire on the advancing German line, buying time for men he cannot see to fall back past him toward the village. A shell impacts close enough to lift him off his feet and throw him backward into the snow. The concussion alone would be enough to end most men's part in this fight. Lopez gets up. He resets the gun, checks the feed, and continues firing, holding the position alone against what witnesses would later describe as a German horde pressing the line, until he is satisfied that his company has completed its withdrawal past his position. He does not leave early. He does not leave when the shelling intensifies or when small arms fire starts finding the range. He leaves only when the men he is protecting are far enough back that his gun is no longer needed at that spot, and by then his uniform is soaked through. His body is bruised from the blast that threw him down, and the temperature is still sitting well below freezing. Early to mid-afternoon. Lopez loads the gun onto his back one more time and runs, through a hail of small arms fire, toward a point where a handful of his comrades are attempting to establish yet another defensive line against the still advancing Germans. This is the third distinct position of the day, each one chosen under fire, each one abandoned only when the tactical picture demanded it, each one costing him ground covered on foot while carrying a weapon that outweighs a third of his own body mass. He sets the gun up beside the small group of survivors and opens fire again, and the belt he feeds into the receiver this time will be his last. He fires until the ammunition is exhausted. There is no resupply coming, no ammunition bearer running forward with another can, because the crew that doctrine assumed would support him has never existed on this battlefield. When the belt runs dry, Lopez does not abandon the weapon. Still carrying his gun, empty now, he falls back with the small group of survivors toward Krinkelt, on foot, through snow, having spent roughly 6.5 hours moving, fighting, and moving again, alone, against a force that outnumbered him by a margin no training manual would call survivable. By the time the guns fall silent along that stretch of the line, the German advance that had been expected to sweep through Company K's position in a matter of hours instead stalls, buying the surrounding American units the time they need to establish a defensive line on the high ground behind Krinkelt. The operation had run from roughly 11:30 in the morning until 6:00 in the evening. 6.5 hours. One man, one weapon meant for 5, and a piece of ground that never fell the way the German timetable required. The tactical effect of what Lopez accomplished east of Krinkelt reached far beyond the fate of a single company. Company K, instead of being enveloped and destroyed piecemeal as German infantry closed around both of its flanks, withdrew as an organized unit, bringing most of its wounded and the bulk of its equipment back toward the village. That withdrawal mattered because it preserved combat power that the 2nd Infantry Division needed for the fight that was still ahead of it, on the high ground known as the Elsenborn Ridge, a stretch of terrain that would become one of the pivotal defensive lines of the entire Battle of the Bulge. German planning for the offensive depended on rapid movement through the road network running past Krinkelt and Rocherath toward the Meuse River, and every hour that American units held those villages, even in a fighting withdrawal, was an hour the German timetable could not recover. The twin villages ultimately fell to the German advance, but not before the delay Lopez and men like him bought allowed the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions to consolidate on Elsenborn Ridge, a position the Germans would never manage to take for the remainder of the battle. Historians of the campaign have consistently identified the fighting at Krinkelt-Rocherath and the subsequent defense of Elsenborn Ridge as one of the critical hinge points of the entire Ardennes offensive, a place where the northern shoulder of the German attack was blunted and never fully recovered. Without that shoulder holding, the German 6th Panzer Army's route toward the Meuse, and the fuel depots beyond it would have opened significantly wider and significantly faster. Individual actions like Lopez's cannot be credited with stopping an entire offensive on their own, and no honest account of the battle would claim that. But the cumulative effect of dozens of small units and individual soldiers refusing to collapse when doctrine and numbers said they should is precisely what turned a German breakthrough into a bulge that never broke through completely. Elsenborn Ridge held through the rest of December and into January, and the offensive that Adolf Hitler had staked much of Germany's remaining strategic reserve on ground to a halt well short of its objectives, in no small part because of the hours bought on days like December 17, in positions like the one Lopez refused to abandon until his company was safe. The official Medal of Honor citation for Sergeant José M. Lopez was issued under General Orders No. 47, dated June 18, 1945, roughly 6 months after the action it described. By the time the award was formalized, Lopez had been promoted from private first class to sergeant, and the citation itself was presented to him in a ceremony at Nuremberg, Germany, by Major General James A. Van Fleet, commander of III Corps, acting in the name of President Harry S. Truman. The citation's language is stripped of adjectives and stays close to the sequence of events, in the clinical style typical of military award documents. It describes how, on his own initiative, Lopez carried his heavy machine gun from Company K's right flank to its left in order to protect that flank, which was in danger of being overrun by advancing enemy infantry supported by tanks. It describes the shallow hole offering no protection above his waist, the 10 Germans cut down in the first engagement, the 25 more killed while attempting to turn his flank, the artillery fire that left him dazed and shaken, the second position taken up alone under pressure from tanks and infantry, and the third position where he fired until his ammunition was exhausted before falling back with the remnants of his unit. The citation closes by crediting Lopez's actions on what it calls seemingly suicidal missions, with killing at least 100 of the enemy and being almost solely responsible for allowing Company K to avoid being enveloped, to withdraw successfully, and to give supporting forces the time needed to build the line that ultimately repelled the German drive. What the citation captures is the sequence of movement, engagement, and casualties inflicted. What it does not fully capture, because no citation can, is the physical reality of what that sequence demanded from one man's body. The repeated hauling of a 45-pound weapon system across open, snow-covered ground under direct fire, the concussion of a near-miss powerful enough to throw him off his feet, and the psychological weight of knowing that every position he abandoned had to hold just long enough, and no man was coming to relieve him. Fellow soldiers who spoke about the action in later years described watching Lopez move under fire and simply not believing what they were seeing. A man half the size of the weapon he carried, refusing to stop until the job in front of him was finished. At the ceremony where the medal was presented, accounts describe organizers building a raised platform for Lopez to stand on, so that General Van Fleet, considerably taller, would not have to stoop to pin the decoration on his chest. A small detail that says as much about the disparity between the size of the man and the size of what he had done as anything written in the official language. Lopez returned to the United States to a hero's welcome, greeted in New York by Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, before continuing home to Texas and to Emilia, the wife he had married just before shipping overseas. His recognition did not stop at the American border. During a pilgrimage to the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico City, the country of his birth awarded him its highest military honor, La Condecoración del Mérito Militar, and Lopez himself often credited his survival to the prayers he had offered to the Virgin of Guadalupe throughout his time in combat. Civilian life in post-war Texas did not treat Lopez the way his record might suggest it should have. He and his family faced open discrimination in Brownsville, including at least one instance of being refused service at a local restaurant, and steady work proved difficult to find despite his status as one of the most decorated soldiers of the entire war. Facing those limited prospects, Lopez re-enlisted in the United States Army in 1949 and went on to serve through the Korean War, adding another chapter of combat experience to a record that already included some of the hardest fighting the European theater had produced. He continued in uniform for more than 2 decades after his return from Belgium, finally retiring from the Army in 1973 with the rank of Master Sergeant. He and Emilia settled in San Antonio, Texas, where Lopez worked for the Veterans Administration, and where the couple raised 5 children together, remaining married for 64 years. He met with multiple American presidents over the following decades, shaking hands with John F. Kennedy at the White House and later meeting George W. Bush. Jose Mendoza Lopez died on May 16, 2005, at the age of 94, and was laid to rest at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery in San Antonio, beside Emilia. His legacy is carved into the landscape of South Texas today. A bronze statue in Brownsville's Veterans Memorial Park depicts him carrying his machine gun. A middle school in San Antonio's Northeast Independent School District bears his name, and a stretch of Interstate 10 running through San Antonio is designated in his honor. He remains one of only 13 Latino Medal of Honor recipients from the Second World War, a distinction that historians and community leaders in South Texas have worked for decades to ensure is not forgotten. There is a particular kind of story that World War II keeps producing, decades after the guns went silent, and Lopez's stand east of Krinkelt belongs to that category. It is not a story about strategy conceived in a headquarters tent or about the movement of divisions on a map. It is a story about one man's decision, made in less than a second, to leave a defensible position and run into open, exposed ground because somewhere he could not see, other men needed him more than his own safety did. Tactical doctrine did not ask Lopez to do what he did that day. Doctrine, in fact, assumed it was impossible, which is exactly why the citation calls his missions seemingly suicidal. He did it anyway, 3 times, because the alternative was watching his company get swallowed whole while he stayed safe behind cover. What makes stories like this one worth telling, again and again, is not simply the body count or the medal that followed it. It is the reminder that the outcome of enormous, impersonal events, offensives involving hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of tanks, sometimes turns on the choices of a single soldier who refuses to accept that his position is hopeless. The Battle of the Bulge would have unfolded differently in countless small ways if men like Lopez had made the safer choice that morning, had stayed in the fortified position on the right flank, and let the left collapse on its own. Nobody would have blamed him for it. The line would simply have broken a little sooner, and the ridge behind Krinkelt might never have held long enough for the rest of the division to dig in. That is the weight these stories carry, and it is why they deserve to be pulled out of dusty archive boxes and told again to people who were not alive to read about them the first time. A single machine gunner, 5 feet 5 inches tall, standing between an army and a piece of high ground that mattered more than anyone fighting for it that morning could have known. That is what one person, refusing to quit, can do to the course of history, and it is a debt that does not expire just because the men who paid it eventually did. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about soldiers who carried more weight, physical and otherwise, than anyone should ever have to carry alone. Real people, real heroism, no exaggeration required. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Jose Lopez doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.